Look, let me at the outset say that I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then at the end tell you what I've just told you, I guess, which is what we are taught as the gems of good presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about the assets of the poor. I should tell you that when many years ago I wrote my first paper as a senior advisor on poverty at UNDP for UNDP's magazine Choices. I called that paper, at that time I was a senior advisor on poverty and sustainable livelihoods, and the phrase sustainable livelihoods did not have much currency at that point. The seminal paper written by what's the two authors now? Keep forgetting their names. Anyway, out of IDS Sussex, on sustainable livelihoods as development ideas for the 21st century. Conway and Chambers. The paper was entitled The Wealth of the Poor. And the Choices magazine editors rejected the paper, and I had a fight for about 6 months before they would publish it, because their claim was that the poor were poor because they had no assets. It was just a contradiction in terms. They didn't see it more as a paradox. But we're going to talk a little bit about the assets of the poor, those which they have and those which they do not have. One of those main assets, obviously, is land. And therefore, land as one example of an asset is going to be important to our conversation. We can come back. Most of you would be familiar, I guess, with state-led models of land redistribution and market-led models and the pros and cons of each of these two approaches. And everybody will say, well, in the days of national ownership of development policies, a la Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, or even more recently in the post-Accra Agenda for Action, in which donors must align their policies with the policies of countries, that we should allow countries to have their own policies and their own approaches. And therefore, state-led models of land redistribution and market-led models should coexist so that a country might pick whichever, or both, if they like. The problem is that these are not normally complementary. One typically undermines the other one. And so alternative ideas of how we might think about assets, including land and poverty, of course, that is closely linked to the productivity issue. And I should say up front, I'm not going to wait for the punchline. I'm going to tell you up front, so I might be quite a boring speaker. If you redistribute assets, it doesn't follow that productivity will increase. Because to have an asset is one thing, to make it productive is another thing. Other things need to be there as well. With those sort of preambular remarks, why don't I go through this quickly? Some of the context here is, of course, as you know, the world is facing, not only in the poor world, but the rich world as well, unprecedented increases in food prices. This has stabilized somewhat. By the time we had the UN Global Conference on the early part of June, 3rd to the 5th of June, in Rome, and the task force was set up, which SG was going to chair. By that time, prices were sort of stabilizing, but they were very high. And the debate continues as to whether the rural poor are the people facing the brunt of those price increases, or others, or the poor in urban areas. And in different contexts, it would be different. And there are all kinds, depending on your ideology or who paid for your research, I guess the conclusion will be different as to what's causing this food price crisis. Some people will actively ignore some of the evidence, such as the biofuels issue. Others will probably overrate it, and there are a whole range of complex factors. Of course, the big question with the food price crisis, if the price is high, great stuff. Let it be as high as possible so poor farmers can benefit. Well, we also know that the supply-demand signals don't work very well in this area of poor farmers. The signals don't get transmitted back for a whole range of reasons, including the issue of the so-called middleman or many middlemen and middlewomen between the market and the poor farmer. And we also know that, if the prices become high now and people start to farm now, they're probably going to produce when you have a glut. So they're going to be worried about that as well, because there's a huge time lag between the price signal and the production cycle, and a whole range. So that's one part of the context, food price crisis. And what do we do about it? So as you might know, this task force set up by the Secretary General had come up with a set of proposals. One were to deal with the immediate challenges, cash transfers, a whole range of safety nets issues and so on. And the other set were longer-term responses in which we would increase resilience so that poor farmers will become less vulnerable to such price shocks and other kinds of shocks that they face. And that leads us to the whole issue of poverty and vulnerability. And for me, that's the question. Prices are going to go up and down. We all know they're cyclical. Some might stay up high. But the people who really suffer are the most vulnerable. And how do we deal with that? And I will argue in this presentation that one of the more, or most, I should say, important ways of dealing with vulnerability, that is to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience, is through property rights. And I'm going to say that in addition, that property rights are necessary but not sufficient, and talk a little bit about what are the other things that are required. And the approach that I would argue that one needs to take is a broader approach. I don't think the food price crisis is an issue of agriculture. It's an issue of poverty. And poverty is much wider than agriculture. The solution for me, therefore, is not an agricultural solution. That's part of the response. I've had this fight, and I love to have this fight. So I know I'm at IFPRI, and I can say this and will provoke some discussion. I've had this discussion with the Food and Agricultural Organization many years ago, when in Malawi, of all places, when they had spent 15 years and spent a lot of UNDP resources on smallholder agricultural productivity, and were not coming up with solutions. Of course, the international financial institutions, who are in fact the people who continue to push market-led land reforms, land redistribution, were arguing that subsidies are bad in all cases. Yes, true, subsidies can be problematic, seriously, but sometimes it works, right? So the new president of Malawi says all this bullshit and my people are still starving, so I'm going to put some subsidies on the fertilizer, and boom, Malawi is no longer food deficit, at least for a short while. How sustainable it will be. The point I want to make is that the solution is not going to be in agriculture alone, and therefore you should open up your minds to a more livelihood, a more systemic or broader analysis to find the solution. So I argue then that the goal that you're really looking for is sustainable livelihoods. And sustainable livelihoods is not the same thing as subsistence living. The two are completely different, although they are sometimes confused. In French, for example, of those of you who speak French, the French would sometimes, or at the beginning of when we were starting this work, will translate sustainable livelihoods as subsistence. But really, livelihoods or sustainable livelihoods is mode d'existence, is the total set of means that people use to make their living. And it's not those that etch out a living on the margins of sustainability, which in fact would be by definition perhaps not sustainable, although they would tread softly on the ecosystem. And I just outline here very quickly the relationship between vulnerability, sustainability, and empowerment. These are the three key phrases, and the links between these three is what I describe here in this slide, where sustainability, as we know, based on these traditional three things of economic effectiveness, ecological integrity, and social equity, together with the capacity to recover from shocks and stresses. Vulnerability is the reverse of that, really. It's the inability to cope with shocks and stresses. And that's, for a lot of the work on sustainable livelihoods, the entry point is really about people's assets, including their capacity to cope with and recover from shocks and stresses. And legal empowerment, or empowerment generally, is one way through which people gain greater control over their lives and their livelihoods. So these concepts and these ideas are intimately linked. Quick point, wealth is not the issue in the world as a whole. We are producing a lot of wealth, tremendous amounts. We are even reducing poverty. The problem is inequality and the way this wealth is distributed around the world. So we have had some phenomenal successes in growth. Even sub-Saharan Africa has been having, 6 to 7% growth, believe it or not. And when you take away growth due to oil prices, you still have significant growth. So somehow we've been having good growth, and yet we've been having great inequality and poverty around the world. And in Latin America, for a long time now, it's not been growth that's been the challenge, or extreme poverty. It's been really inequality and relative poverty. And that's what we have to challenge. How do we deal with this inequality then? In our report on the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor, one of the staggering things we found was that 4 billion people on the planet are not able to use the law to protect their asset base or to create new economic opportunity. And that 4 billion includes the 1 billion of the poorest of the poor, the other 1.6, which is over, who live on more than $2 a day, and then another 1.4, which is above the $2, but they are not able to use the law efficiently. They are excluded. It's like hidden in plain sight. They are there, they're making their living, they live in sometimes what is called shadow economy or the underground economy, and there are at least 116 different phrases that describe the same thing. And we can show that the lower the GDP of a country, the greater the percentage of people in the informal sector. The stats are there, they're pretty clear. There's in the more advanced countries where the per capita income is of the order of $20,000 or something like that, the informal economy is of the order of 10%. When you go down and you go to the least developed countries, $400 per capita income, it rises, the percentage of GDP rises to almost 50%. And the percentage of the population who are making their living in the informal sector is about 90%. So in India, for example, about 92% of the population of India is making its living in the informal sector. That is to say, they are not using the law to their advantage. They're afraid of the law. The law is seen by poor people as punitive. It is not a guardian of their interests. And that's what our commission really focused on. What's wrong? Why is it that more and more people are turning away from using the law than working with it? And what do we do about it? We have described a process of legal empowerment as follows. The conditions we argue, the first thing is people have to exist legally. So legal identity is the first thing. You'd be surprised that 1 million Peruvians do not exist legally, adult Peruvians. And 4 million Venezuelans do not exist legally. It's an amazing thing. So how are they going to begin? We take a credit card, for example, for granted. But these people can't benefit from social safety nets. They can't have a bank account. They can do virtually anything. They can't use the law for anything. Now, some will argue that some people benefit from not having a legal identity. But that small percentage of people who are more interested in criminal activity is by far the exception rather than the rule. In fact, we had to use a phrase, and we sort of copied the phrase from one of our co-chairs, Hernando de Soto, who uses the phrase extra-legal. You know why he uses the phrase extra-legal? And I had this clash with a Brazilian jurist, actually, who said people like you are going to confuse everything. Lawyers have two things. It's very simple. It's very clear. You're either legal or you're illegal. That's it. So I said, well, very well, sir. But in the world in which we work and live, when we look at the world, if I go back to the Gaussian distribution, the little bell curve, a small percentage of people in the developing world are able to use the law to their advantage. That's about 15% or less. Another small percentage, about 15% or so, or less, are people who are criminals. And the majority, 70% of the people, are in neither of those groups. They are neither legal nor illegal. So while you work with your law books, you are not dealing with reality of the developing world, of the people who live in the developing world, where there are large masses of poverty. And that reality needs to be taken in. In other words, your law books are not describing reality. And I checked that with the Chief Justice of the Philippines, the Chief Justice of Indonesia, to give you two examples, and they agreed. But they added very quickly, it's not my job to change the law. My job is to interpret the law. It's the politicians' jobs. Politicians are the people who must look at this and reflect the people's reality into the legal and institutional structures of the country. And that is why the legal empowerment work is much more a political work than a legal work. So, anyway, legal identity and identity as an actor in society, either as a worker, as a business person, and so on, are important issues. The other aspects are information and education. People have to know. In fact, if people are not aware of their circumstances and the possibility for change, they are not likely to form groups and demand change. And we argue that the first step is for people to be able to articulate their own condition, to have enough information of their condition and of the possibility of change, and then to be able to organize themselves so that they have voice. And that's at the heart of the empowerment process. And then we talked of four areas of change, 4 domains. We couldn't answer this whole big question of, as to how do we solve the problem of informality, if it is indeed a problem. Some cases people will argue that that's the solution rather than the problem. But we will show, and we can show very easily, the data suggests that people who live in the informal sector earn much less. They are much less productive than people in the formal sector. So we divided our work into 4 areas. In the area of access to justice and the rule of law, to the area of property rights, labor rights, and business rights. And the last area of business rights is a new phrase. People have not traditionally used the phrase business rights. And we have sort of defined it clearly to say that these are not yet formally accepted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we are arguing that such rights need to be debated and considered. So access to these 4 domains, we argue, through a process of systemic change and not only in one area, is going to lead people to be able to protect their asset base better and to be able to generate greater economic opportunity. And that's our definition of legal empowerment. The ability to protect what you have and to generate new economic opportunity to do better in life. So that's the heart of our work. That's a summary of virtually everything we did. But let me just illustrate quickly and then come to some conclusions.